Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. How much damage will Western sanctions do to the Russian economy, and how much damage might they do to the West itself? And secondly, what are the implications of a policy to sequester Russia's national reserves? Those are two key issues I should raise today with the chief economics correspondent of the Financial Times, the highly regarded and widely read Martin Wolf. However, Mr. Wolf, I'm going to start a little differently because I noticed in an article you wrote for your paper, the Financial Times, this morning, you began by saying a new world is being born. And you speak about how a combination of war, supply shocks, and high inflation is destabilizing. Financial instability now seems very likely. A prolonged bout of stagflation, you say, seems certain. For the benefit of those who haven't had the privilege of reading that article, could you briefly spell out your concerns?
Yes, I think it's very clear now that Russia's war on Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, has triggered some really important repercussions, which I'll come to in a moment. But it's crucial to remember that we entered this new world, what I call this transformed world, already after some very profound shocks. And the most important of these has been the consequence of a very, very prolonged period of very low interest rates after the global financial crisis, reinforced by the COVID pandemic, which has created an immense amount of froth and very high values in financial markets worldwide. And in addition to that, it has created, again, before the war even started, a very turbulent recovery from the COVID shock, including extraordinarily high inflation in the developed world by the standards of the last 40 years. So we entered into this more recent period with already really quite unstable economies. We expected, and I expect, substantial tightening of monetary policy, and already expected inflation to remain high for quite a long period, while the central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, tried to tighten monetary policy and bring down inflation, which is soaring far above target levels, 7% or more. Then we get this shock. It obviously has many ramifications, which I discussed, but just to focus on the economics of it, it has led to a very rapid further rise in energy and also food prices worldwide. This will further exacerbate inflation. It's a supply shock, which tends, therefore, to reduce potential output. And that means that any given level of demand is likely to be more inflationary. And because it's a supply shock, as I've already indicated, it's an upward price shock. So the central banks are going to be under even more pressure to tighten, precisely at the time when the economies are weakening, because this is a reduction in real incomes for most people around the world, but above all in developed countries, and particularly so in net importing developed countries, net importers of food, and not food so much energy, in Europe above all. So people are poorer, but inflation is higher. That's part of the mechanism for making them poorer. But the central banks will simply have to, in my view, will have to bring down this high inflation and make clear that it's not going to be allowed to alter inflation expectations and create a significant permanent inflationary situation. That guarantees stagflation, a period in which output is weak because central banks are tightening, while inflation, which has a great deal of inertia, continues. And in many respects, though there are differences, this makes it more like the mid-70s with the oil shock and then the Yom Kippur War, which came together to trigger the first oil shock, and then, of course, the second oil shock when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. It looks more like that period, the combination of war affecting energy supplies. Russia is a huge energy supplier. At the same time as we already have large inflationary pressures. The additional thing we have, and this is my conclusion, is this time more so than then, was these very high asset prices, lots of bubbles in financial markets, and there is a good chance, not a certainty, that in this world we will have some quite severe financial shocks, particularly if interest rates on the dollar, the principal world's currency, shoot up. So that is, as it were, the economic analysis of where we are, in my view.
So in fact, what you're saying to an audience in India is, whilst the world is riveted and focused on the crisis, which is a military crisis in the Ukraine, there is a very deep and worrying economic crisis that is developing, and attention will need to be paid to that fairly expeditiously, because handling it is not going to be easy or simple.
I think that there was already a significant economic problem. As I've indicated, inflation has been far too high. We don't understand how our labor markets are performing, but they look very hot. And then we had this huge shock in a war, sanctions affecting a very significant country, of course, Russia, and of course, Europe, dramatically so as a net energy importer. So, yes, it is very likely that it will cause significant economic turbulence.
Let's then, against that background, come to the very severe sanctions which have been imposed by the West on Russia. Publicly, at any rate, Putin has tried to make light of them. He's even seemingly brushed them aside. So let me first ask you, what do you believe will be their full impact on the Russian economy? And side by side, will we see that as a process that works out in weeks and months, or will the sanctions begin to bite pretty hard pretty soon?
Well, I think, in some respects, it's obvious the sanctions have already bitten very hard. The ruble has collapsed. So the external value of the Russian currency is dramatically reduced. Which is very significant. The Russian stock market has been closed for days. The Russian companies, there are very significant ones with large businesses in the West, they've not been closed down, of course, but they are clearly very, very vulnerable to the sanctions pressure, and their businesses have become more or less pariahs. Including, of course, many of their owners, the oligarchs, have been sanctioned in many different ways. Russia's foreign currency reserves have, at least half of them, been rendered, been neutered, if that's the word, sequestered, essentially blocked. And that's why they can't do anything about the ruble. Inflation, therefore, in Russia is bound to shoot up. There's no way this can be avoided. Access to bank accounts in Russia has been made more problematic, and credit card provision, as far as I can see, been largely frozen. So it's a very big shock to the modern and more internationally exposed parts of the Russian economy. And if it continues in a long time, it will force Russia to become pretty close to self-sufficient again, not entirely, because it will continue, obviously, to trade with China, but it will lose what is still, in aggregate, easy access to the markets and easy access to both the markets for goods and services and the financial markets of the West, which is still the biggest single component of the world economy. What will this mean for Russian GDP? Nobody knows. I've seen estimates of a recession this year of somewhere between 8 and 15%. The latter will be dramatic. It could be worse. But I think there's no doubt that the economic shock to Russia is very, very substantial. They can still continue with their war. They're largely self-sufficient in that way. But the standards of living of a very large number of Russians, and particularly, as it were, the more modern Russians, the Russians in the world market economy, engaged in globally oriented activity, their standards of living, their economic position is going to be dramatically reduced.
Now, it's often said that the sanctions that will bring Russia to its knees is when Europe starts or stops buying Russian gas and oil. That, I believe, and the figure varies depending upon which paper you read, gives Russia something between $300 million and $400 million a day. But how likely is it that Europe will desist and stop buying Russian oil and gas sometime soon? I know there is talk about finding alternates like LNG, but is this one area, because it will hurt Europe enormously, where progress will be a lot slower than rhetoric?
I think the answer to your last question is yes, progress will be slow. There's a lot of disagreement on this in Europe still. And that's partly because the degree of dependence on Russian gas, above all, I'll come to this crucial point, varies very much by country, with Germany and Italy, of the large countries, particularly exposed. And of course, they use it for heating, but above all, they use it to drive their power stations. So it's the main source, ultimately the main source of electric power, and cutting off electric power to a large modern economy like Germany's is pretty near impossible. So, but the crucial point, I think, let's separate oil from gas. They're very different stories. They have very different economic characteristics. Oil is basically traded in the world economy. It's true that a lot of Russian oil comes out through the West, but in time, it wouldn't be instantaneous. It can be traded out through the East and South. So if the Europeans decide not to buy Russian oil again, the Americans apparently have already decided, but they import almost none. Britain too imports almost none. The oil market will be disrupted somewhat, but the Europeans will not in the very long run, reasonably swiftly, be able to get oil from elsewhere, and Russian oil will go out through other channels, probably and particularly through China, and the world oil market will be disrupted, and there might be a period when oil prices are particularly high, which basically means the transport fuel, it's petrol, in Europe. But Europe is a rich continent. Drivers can mostly pay more. Some will drive less. But in the end, I think the oil economy's effect of a purely European embargo on Russian oil wouldn't be that massive. And if the West wants to, it can offset it in significant part by allowing Iranian oil and Venezuelan oil back on the market. It's not inconceivable. So I don't get too excited about the oil situation, except, of course, even before this, oil prices have got very high. You in India must know this very well. Globally, oil prices are high. They will remain high. But I think, if anything, actually, a European embargo on Russian oil would tend to lower world prices, so actually favorable to other countries. Now, gas is very different. Gas performs this absolutely vital function. It provides a lot of the heating and, above all, the electric power generation in large parts of Europe. And gas is mostly provided via pipelines. It's fixed. It's sort of fixed transfer to the destination of the pipeline, which most of the Russian ones end up in Europe. And the getting other sources of gas in large quantities is feasible technically, but it's a very big job. You basically have to do it through LNG. My understanding is there's not so much available. You know, Europe is a very large consumer, not an expert on this, but they displacing Russian gas, which supplies an enormous proportion of gas supply, which outperforms this vital function, is going to be very, very hard in the short run. So I do imagine there could be an oil embargo. It wouldn't make so much difference to either side, but it would be largely redundant. A gas embargo would have certainly a dramatic effect on Russia. They would find it much more difficult than with oil to ship it elsewhere, but it would also have a very dramatic effect on Europe. I would be surprised if they agreed a gas embargo in the short run. But we are coming out of the winter. That means they have the opportunity to start a massive investment program to shift the supply of gas. They can start trying to build up stocks over the summer, which are low, obviously, the end of the winter, and therefore then hope possibly that by next winter they're in a position at least to diminish very substantially their reliance on Russian gas. Whether they will do that is, I think, to me at the moment, not clear. But it's clearly gas that's going to be the big problem, not oil.
Given the sanctions that are in place, to what extent can Chinese banks and Chinese financial institutions like UnionPay either provide an alternate financial route or perhaps even bail out Russian companies, Russian banks?
I think that's a very interesting question to which at the moment we don't know the answer. There are several issues there. First, of course, it has geopolitical implications, and it is conceivable, and I would have thought quite likely, that Chinese banks that do this would be sanctioned by the West. For some of them, that this would not matter, but some of them have long been quite significantly engaged. In fact, for a very long time, Bank of China, for example, in the world economy and in global finance, and Western markets are not unimportant. So they would have to consider the implications if sanctions were extended. The second issue is in what currency would they be doing this? They would find it very difficult to do in dollars, and that would expose, in the extreme, China itself to some reduction in their access to their huge reserves. Remember, China has enormous reserves, which are also overwhelmingly in Western currencies, above all in the dollar, and they're exposed, as Russia is, to action taken against them. I first argued this point in a book I wrote that was published in 2008. Nobody seems to have paid any attention to it, but there was this ludicrous idea that China's reserves gave China power over America, when, as has now been clearly demonstrated, the reverse is the case. And I was perfectly aware of this 14 years ago. So they have 3.5 trillion, I think, currently, and that's a lot of money, and it's very vulnerable. So they would have to be careful in what they do in dollars. So they'd have to do it in rubles. The renminbi. But renminbi is a semi-inconvertible currency. The Russians will want a currency that allows them to buy stuff worldwide. And obviously the question is whether if renminbi are provided to Russia, China would allow them to be convertible, and in what way, into foreign currencies, and access to that will be permitted by Western countries, because it would probably have to go through Western currency markets. The dollar side certainly would almost certainly have to be cleared through Western currency and financial markets, and they could make that very difficult, if not stop it. So I'm not a technical expert on this, but my guess from what I know and see is that for China to replace in full what Russia has lost by losing its access to Western financial markets, separation of the Western banking system, and loss of the use of a large part of its reserves. For China to replace that will be very difficult, possibly impossible, and also politically push them further into the Russian camp, cement further the split between China and the West. And you have to remember that whatever the geopolitics may be, for China, Western markets in every possible way are far, far more important than Russia. And they would have to think very carefully about making this huge leap into what would become, in all probability, an economic war with the West.
I'll very quickly add that according to this morning's papers, the Russian Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said to the Spanish Foreign Minister that China does not want to have to suffer the same sanctions, and that in a sense underlines the point you're making. But Mr.
Exactly.
Wood, alongside the sanctions imposed by Western governments on Russian banks, on Russia's reserves and its exports, very high-profile Western companies have also decided to opt out of Russia. These include banks like Goldman Sachs, Visa and MasterCard, McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, and the Hilton, and very importantly, British Petroleum as well. Now, am I right in my belief that the main cost for Russia will be A, loss of jobs, and B, a loss of a lifestyle that they've got accustomed to for 3 decades? Although in the case of BP, because that involves substantial investment in Russian oil and gas, the cost could be a lot more too.
Well, just to start with BP, I had a look overnight at what has happened to the value of the stocks of major oil companies around the world. And it's exactly as you expect. American oil companies have seen enormous increases in their value. America is, of course, I think it is now the largest single producer of oil in the world anyway. It's enormous. And American oil companies are invested in that. And there's no question of anybody embargoing American oil. So they are doing very well. The Russian oil companies' market value has collapsed. And BP, which is very exposed to Russia, its value is basically hardly risen, even though the price of oil has risen so much. And that tells you, that, which we know, is that BP is very vulnerable to this need now to separate itself from Russia, and its future is certainly questioned. Shell is also somewhat exposed, as far as I can see, and it is also not doing very well. So there's a really large effect there in the divergence of experience and now prospective performance of different oil companies. Now, in terms more broadly, what is the impact of these Western withdrawals? Now, the Russian government is saying that it can nationalize these businesses. I would have imagined that many of these businesses could keep going, though they couldn't legally use the same brand name. Whether the Russians in this situation will worry about that, I don't know. Whether they would have rename McDonald's with some patriotic Russian name, I don't know. But clearly they can go on making hamburgers, and the supply chains for these sorts of products are overwhelmingly domestic anyway. Similarly, hotels can't be taken somewhere else, but there aren't going to be any tourists. So the withdrawal of Hilton is probably sort of an irrelevance. The banks, yes, that's just part of the broader financial sanctions, which are much more important than whether Goldman is located there. What I think is true, so in the short run, next few months, I don't see these withdrawals. I may be wrong. There may be something very important I'm missing, but I don't see these withdrawals as very significant in the scale of the shock that is now being suffered by Russia from other sources. Now, if in the long run, these sanctions remain in place, the war is unresolved, the conflict with Russia continues, and we don't know whether that will happen. Maybe there will be peace tomorrow. We hear about peace discussions. But in the long run, I think there is clearly now, and it's not just American companies, it also includes very important European companies, a massive reconsideration of their exposure to Russia, where they are reconsidering whether Russia is a reliable economic partner with a reliable government. I think many of them will conclude that it isn't, that Mr. Putin is simply too unpredictable and dangerous, and they will withdraw. And trade will also be hindered. We're clearly withdrawing our present trade relations, trade policy towards Russia is being changed. And the West is a very important trading partner for Russia, natural trading partner. It's a commodity exporter, essentially, and imports sophisticated goods and services, essentially from the West and China. Those are the most obvious sources. So this means that over time, the Russian economy will become more closed, more inward-looking, and above all, and decisively more dependent on China. And I think the biggest consequence economically of all this, as geopolitically, if the crisis is not resolved, is that Russia will become economically and politically, as I said, even more a large satellite of China, but one with enormous number of nuclear warheads.
Let's look at the flip side, if that's the right way of putting it, of the sanctions. Will there be, as I presume there needs to be, some sort of blowback? What will be the adverse impact on the West of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia?
Well, this comes back to where we started and the global overview, which I'm particularly concerned by. It depends, first and foremost, and we have to come back to this, on the way the export, how it affects Russia's exports of important commodities. So that's not just energy and food. It's also some very important metals. Nickel, for example, which is a vital raw material now. So the question is, will there be embargoes on these flows by the Russians to punish the West, even though they desperately need the money, or by the West to punish Russia? And at the moment, in these respects, we don't know. This comes back to the very good question you asked about oil and gas, but it also applies to other things, as I said, like metals. Now, the more that trade flow is disrupted, the higher the prices of these things get, the more the short-term disruption for the Western economies. There might even need to be rationing of some products. There's already talk about the possibility we're going to end up having to ration gas to our consumers, probably by protecting households and allowing gas supplies to be interrupted to firms. But we don't know about this. And the really big uncertainties here is we don't know how disrupted these trades are going to become. So that's the first really big set of questions, the vital raw materials, in which Russia is a very important supplier. And I've mentioned those already. Then, of course, there's the inflationary push. I mean, the prices of oil and gas have shot up. This war is certainly not the only reason, because we already saw that before. But the cumulative price rise in oil over the last year or more rivals that in 74. So we've had an enormous oil shock. It's an inflationary shock, but it's also a big reduction in real incomes. And it's a particularly large reduction in net real incomes for countries which are net importers, because the higher prices that their consumers are paying for these now much more expensive raw materials are not going to domestic producers, they're going to world producers, not just Russians, all over the world. So just as with any huge oil shock or energy price shock, food price shock, there's a big transfer from consumers to producers in income. That makes consumers poorer. They can't buy as much. And consumers generate most of the demand in Western societies. So their reduction in consumption will mean a recession. I mean, certainly a massive slowdown in growth. In America, which is not a net importer of energy or these other raw materials, mostly, the gainers will match the losers, but they won't spend their winnings, which mostly will accrue to the profits of companies at once. So even there will be an inflationary impact, which will be important. There's already a lot of inflation and a recessionary impact, but it will, in the medium term, be offset by spending by the people who gain. In Europe, there are no gainers. So, and I imagine the same is true in India. I mean, with huge prices rises in energy, it's a net loss for India, and the Indian economy will be poorer, and Indian households will be poorer, and that will slow down demand. In the West, in England, we now call this the cost of living crisis. It was there before, and it's got worse. And in the combination of high inflation with reduced real incomes, because of the net transfers outside our societies, it creates huge policy questions. Are they going to offset this with monetary policy or with fiscal policy? How are they going to deal with it? But the combination seems to me almost certain to lead to significant slowdowns, even recessions in quite a wide number of countries. And that's the blowback.
Let me ask you specifically about two concerns that have been voiced in the media. One, aircraft leasing companies could end up losing control effectively of over 100 aircraft worth, it's estimated, something like $13 billion because they're stuck in Russia and they can't get them back. And secondly, I believe that there is also concern about certain pension funds and investment funds. The ones that I mentioned are BlackRock and Pacific, that seem to have a fairly large exposure to Russian money.
It's not, well, I think the first case sounds very, very plausible to me. I'm not an expert on where this industry is, but the leasing industry is likely to make losses. The leasing industry is part of the financial sector more broadly, and there are clearly going to be losses in the financial sector directly from loans to investments in Russia. That's the byproduct of the sanctions and the economic and political rift with Russia. I didn't emphasize this in the blowback because actually I think it's in aggregate very small. Yes, they're going to make losses because they've taken a bet on a country that turned out to be a much more dangerous investment than they thought it would be. In the history of finance over the last couple of centuries, that happens quite frequently. They lost far more in the Russian Revolution. They lost everything, and they'd invested a lot in Russia. But the exposure of the direct exposure of the Western financial sector, Western pensions to Russia or even China is relatively small. Nearly all their assets are held in themselves. In their own countries, they're the biggest, most liquid markets, and otherwise all across the world in a fairly diversified manner. So I don't think this, though it's real, these losses will themselves be crucial. I read something about BlackRock losing $17 billion. But this is a memory. I think that number is right on Russian bonds, and which is embarrassing, and of course a loss to the owners of these funds. But BlackRock has trillions of dollars under management. It really is a very small loss. It's the indirect effects via oil prices, energy prices more broadly, food prices, increasing uncertainty, and the possible ramifications of changes in monetary policy in the West that are going to be the decisive forms of blowback, not these direct losses.
One more question about sanctions before I switch to the second subject in the limited time left, which is to do with the reserve situation. India at the moment is considering very seriously a deal to buy Russian oil at heavily discounted prices. The White House has made it clear that this wouldn't violate the sanctions that are in place. But it does raise other questions, and that's what I want to ask you. How do you believe the West as a whole would respond if India went ahead with this deal at this moment in time?
Now, this is a guess because I have never discussed it with anybody, but I think they would shrug and do absolutely nothing. As I said, my view is that the Western sanctions on or the concern about Western sanctions on Russian oil would lower prices elsewhere. And what the story you're just telling me is consistent with that, although obviously from what are now very high levels. The Western world is going to accept grudgingly, I think, but it is going to accept, in my view, India's somewhat sitting on the fence position in all this. This is not, as you say, a direct violation of Western sanctions. It's the Western world would like a close relationship with India, above all America would. It's not going to jeopardize that over this. It hopes that in time, may well be very foolish, that India will somewhat separate itself from Russia, but people understand pretty well the history of India's relations with Russia, and that India is a country with interests of its own, which it want to protect so far as it can. So I don't think this is going to be very problematic, in truth, in these complex relations. I don't think India can do much to weaken the overall sanctions. It doesn't have the financial sector or financial strength to offset Western sanctions any more than, in my view, well, certainly even less than China does. So I think this is all going to be perfectly manageable as things are.
The other issue I want to touch upon with you is the implications of the West sequestering, if that's the right term, Russian reserves. As you said, these amount to just over $300 billion. And this is a sort of step that would worry many countries, particularly China, who keep their reserves in dollars, but also, I suppose, partly in sterling and euros as well. How do you see such countries behaving? How much of a worry and concern would this be to them?
This brings back to the discussion we had earlier. I think it's a fascinating question, and we don't know the answer. It has always seemed clear to me, looking at the behavior of the United States vis-a-vis Iran, notably over a long period, that the view around the world that the liabilities of American debts, are absolutely 100% safe money, which is what reserves are supposed to be, that's a very naive view. Because America has always made it clear that if those reserves are held by a country it comes to see as an enemy, then it can act against them, because they're all ultimately, if not lodged in America, because they might be held in elsewhere, transacting in them almost always, nearly 100, requires transactions in Western financial markets, and those can be stopped. So people shouldn't be surprised, but they are. I've been struck that many people thought the Americans would never do this to a country as important as Russia. But in extremis, they will. The debts of other countries are not safe money. The safest money you can have is having an internationally acceptable currency of your own. If the rupee, for example, were as acceptable in the world as the dollar, India's vulnerability will be dramatically reduced, The difficulty is making your currency an internationally acceptable reserve currency is dramatically difficult and usually takes decades and very large policy changes, including complete convertibility, acceptance, open financial markets, free financial markets, and all the rest of it, which most countries don't want to do. So they're stuck, they're caught. They end up having to hold the major Western currencies if they want tradable reserves, freely convertible reserves, which reserves have to be, and that is a point of vulnerability. So they now realize this. There are a number of solutions. One is not to hold so many reserves and try and hold something else, foreign currency reserves. That usually means something like gold, and there's a limited gold stock, but in the end, all you do is drive up the gold price by bidding against others. Gold is hardly nearly all the gold, well, virtually all gold was mined a long time ago, as it were. So there's not much you can do about that. And there aren't really good alternative reserve assets. You can try to go in for bilateral trading and swap arrangements with other developing and emerging countries, but that's messy and complicated. Or, as I said, you can try to make your own currency a genuinely internationally acceptable reserve asset, in which case you don't need to hold foreign currency reserves. The US doesn't hold any virtually. But to do that, you need radical reform and development of your own economy. So I think the rest of the world is at the moment stuck. The most likely replacement is the Chinese RMB, but it's pretty obvious to anyone who thinks about it. Let's be clear, if India invested most of its reserves in Chinese renminbi, they will be at least as vulnerable to Chinese interference as the dollar reserves are by America, if not more. And I think the Chinese themselves are not going to be willing to make the policy changes necessary to make the renminbi a genuinely international currency. It would have to become an open market economy, and it's not going to do that. It's going in the opposite direction. So the conclusion of this, it's not surprising, and there's nothing you can do about it.
This is the interesting thing. There are two paradoxes you point out. One that you wrote about, I believe you said it was in 2008, 14 years ago, that the fact that you're sitting on sizable reserves may suggest prima facie that you're a very rich and wealthy country, but it also suggests that you become very vulnerable because your reserves are in dollars. And if the Americans want to act against you, they can, and they can do it in a way that can leave you helpless. But the second thing you point out is that people don't have an alternative in terms of another currency to move to. The yuan or the renminbi is not going to be acceptable to countries like India and to many other countries as well. And secondly, there's a limit in the amount you can hold in gold, both because of the quantity of the metal, but also the desirability of holding your reserves in gold. So this is a very worrying situation, but there is no obvious solution other than to keep your fingers crossed and hope for the best.
The truth is that as the world is now, if you're part of the world economy, and you're part of the world economy because you want to buy imports because you need them, you're not self-sufficient. You can't be. India tried self-sufficiency and it never really worked. So you're not. You're going to have to hold and trade in internationally acceptable currencies. And internationally acceptable currencies are a limited number of currencies issued by major Western open market, sophisticated financial market countries, which is basically the US, the Eurozone, Japan, in the UK, and Swiss franc to a small degree. That's what you have. There isn't anything else, because you're not going to go out and hold your reserves in Brazilian reais or the RMB, and they're not going to hold all their reserves in rupee because it's not a fully convertible open currency. And that means you're stuck. Yes, you're subject to Western power. This is clearly true. And the alternative is to go back to autarky, which has never worked very well. And at extreme east, you become North Korea, which doesn't need dollar reserves. But who wants to be North Korea?
Absolutely. One last question before I end, and I accept that it is probably just a theoretical question, but nonetheless, I want to ask it to you because if, and I know this is a huge if and it's unlikely, but if large sums of national reserves were somehow to decide to move out of the dollar, whether it's to some other currency or to gold, what impact would that have on the dollar? I know it's only a potential, not a realistic threat for the dollar, but nonetheless, just to complete the discussion.
Well, I think if there were flight, it would go into one of the other currencies I mentioned. And in terms of size, the euro is the most plausible one. So people basically try to shift their reserves, which are currently, I haven't looked at the most recent figures, about 2/3 in dollars, with the euro being the next biggest one, maybe 20%. Again, I haven't looked at it very recently of the total reserves. There could be a shift between them, but of course, there are quite a number of problems. First of all, the truth is that in extremis, Eurozone policy in these sorts of areas is going to be very close to that of America because they're allies, very close allies, as we've been reminded. None of the currency, all the current countries with internationally tradable currencies are close allies of the US because they're part of the Western system. So the diversification into them doesn't help much. But you could have a situation in which the euro goes up and the dollar goes down significantly. That really did happen, though then it was the D-mark against the dollar in the 70s. That's exactly what happened. And against the yen, dramatically, the dollar went down. This reinforced inflation in the US, and it meant that people who'd borrowed dollars while it was going down were immediately benefited. Their dollar value of their debt fell, and I remember this working at the World Bank, and the value of their D-mark or yen debts, not so large, went up, and so you had big losses on that. Unfortunately, that's only the beginning. Sooner or later, if the dollar goes down, inflation shoots up. I expect monetary policy in the US to be dramatically tightened. I think it's very likely now, and that means the people who borrowed in dollars will get higher interest rates, and so they will be hit that way. Meanwhile, the holders of the currencies will lose when the dollar goes down, and that will reinforce their desire to go into other currencies. So you can imagine, a number of debtors will be badly hit in complex ways, depending on what currencies they're exposed to and what happens to interest rates. And there will be a diversification of reserve assets out of the dollar into other Western currencies, but that will be limited. And it will be limited ultimately because the US has the largest, most liquid financial markets, and it has the largest and most liquid government bond market. And the Eurozone doesn't have that. It's still segmented. Its financial markets are segmented. Its debt markets are segmented into national debt markets with the D-mark, with the German bond market particularly small. So in the end, while there will be these price adjustments, which will be complicated, interest rate adjustments, I don't think you can get away from the US. It's the largest open economy in the world with the most integrated financial markets, the largest government bond market, and it's a military superpower. So in the end, if you want to hold safe money, it's very difficult to escape the US. And and I've argued now this for years and years when people were talking about how the RMB would replace it. In the long run, China could replace it if it gets big enough and changes enough. But for the next 10, 20 years, I think you can lose money on the dollar. They made a mess of monetary policy this time. But in the end, you can't escape being exposed to the dollar. It just is the dominant currency for fundamental structural reasons.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wolf. This has been not just comprehensive, but I might even use the phrase almost encyclopedic, because I think there will be people who will be riveted, who will learn an awful lot and also get a very big tour de horizon picture of exactly what the world faces. Thank you very much. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Great pleasure.